Welcome back to our explainer on the Book of Numbers. Now, you know the drill, don't let the name fool you. While yes, it does contain plenty of census, its Hebrew title, Bamidbar, which translates to in the wilderness, is honestly way more accurate. We're picking up exactly where Leviticus left off. The Israelites are camped out at the foot of Mount Sinai, gearing up for what really should have been a super quick march to the Promised Land. Instead, well, it turns into this tragic 40-year epic of wandering, rebellion, and raw survival. We're talking about a massive population constantly on the move. And today, we're zeroing in on the insane logistics and the absolutely massive spiritual burden placed on one very specific group within that camp, the Levites, and their sacred tribal duties.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this operation, picture an army of over 600,000 men. 603,550 to be exact. That is a huge fighting force. This number came from the very first census God commanded out there in the wilderness. And remember, this wasn't for taxes or anything mundane. This was a straight-up military draft. They were counting every single able-bodied guy aged 20 and older ready for war. It's a massive, highly organized army prepped to conquer the Promised Land.
But right in the middle of all this massive military organization, there is a glaring exception. Out of the 13 tribal groups, one entire tribe is explicitly left off the draft list. God actually commands Moses not to number them with the army. Okay, let's dive into this, because why on earth would you leave a whole tribe behind when you're literally prepping for war? Well, it's because the tribe of Levi, the Levites, were being drafted for a totally different kind of warfare. They were assigned a much more dangerous, highly spiritual mission, guarding and serving the tabernacle, the literal dwelling place of God on earth.
Which brings us to Section 1, Guardians at the Center.
Let's look at exactly how they were positioned, because their geographical setup in the camp wasn't random, it was incredibly strategic. God gave meticulous instructions for how millions of Israelites were supposed to arrange their tents. On the outer ring, you got the standard 12 tribes, Judah to the east, Reuben south, Ephraim west, and Dan on the north. Dead center is the tabernacle. But that inner ring, that is 100% Levites. They were camped completely around the tabernacle, essentially acting as a literal living buffer between a lethal, infinitely holy God and a very flawed, very human people. Basically, they were human shields for the divine presence.
Now, they weren't just glorified security guards. Their role carried this unbelievably deep theological weight, operating on the principle of substitution. Remember back to the events of the Passover in Egypt. All the firstborn of Israel were consecrated to God. But here in the book of Numbers, God essentially makes a trade. He takes the Levites as his own, giving them as a gift to the priests to serve in place of all the firstborn across the entire nation. It's this profound spiritual trade-off. The sacred duties of the whole community were placed squarely on their shoulders.
Moving on to Section 2, a division of sacred labor.
To handle a job of this magnitude, the Levites couldn't just wing it. They were broken down into what you could totally call special forces divisions to manage the tabernacle. First up, the Kohathites. These guys were the inner guardians, strictly responsible for moving the most holy things, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden lampstand, the altars. Next, you have the Gershonites. They were essentially the fabric handlers, entrusted with moving those massive tents, the heavy coverings, and the courtyard curtains. And finally, the Merarites, the heavy lifters. They were tasked with hauling the huge structural pillars, the bases, and the heavy frames. This insanely precise logistical breakdown is exactly what allowed the literal presence of God to dismantle, pack up, and move with the nation across a really unforgiving desert.
But listen, we absolutely cannot overstate the danger of this job, especially for that first group, the Kohathites. There is a very stark warning right in Numbers chapter 4. They shall not touch the holy things, lest they die. Their task was by far the most sacred, but it was also the most lethal. The holiness of God was so absolute, so severe, that if a Kohathite slipped up and directly touched the ark or an altar, instant death, literally game over.
Because the stakes were literally life and death, the operational sequence had to be absolutely flawless. We're talking an exact, step-by-step teardown process. Step 1. Before the Kohathites could even step foot inside, Aaron's sons, the priests, had to go in and completely cover the holy items. Only then, Step 2, could the Kohathites come in and actually carry them using special poles. While that's happening, Step 3, the Gershonites are packing up all those massive curtains and coverings. And then finally, Step 4, the Merarites lift out the heavy structural pillars and bases. Every single person had a vital role, and they had to execute it perfectly, or people would die. No pressure, right?
That takes us to Section 3, Surviving a Sacred Rebellion.
Okay, so you put a bunch of people in a grueling wilderness environment, add in an incredibly strict, high-stakes hierarchy, and yeah, eventually you're gonna hit some serious internal tension. What happens when someone decides they just don't like their assigned role? Well, enter Korah. Korah was a Levite himself, and he, along with a crew of others, decided this whole operational hierarchy just wasn't fair. They looked at Moses and Aaron, the exclusive leaders and priests, and straight up launched a mutiny. Just listen to his challenge. You take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? Korah wanted the priesthood. He wanted the prestige. He was fundamentally challenging the exact division of sacred labor that God had just established.
God's response to this mutiny was terrifying and totally definitive. The ground literally opened up and swallowed Korah and his rebellious followers whole. Right after that, a massive plague broke out in the camp, killing 14,700 people, and it only stopped because Aaron rushed in to intercede. Then, to permanently shut down any future debate about who was in charge, God did something fascinating. He had the leaders of every single tribe place a wooden rod inside the tabernacle. The very next morning, only Aaron's rod had miraculously budded and actually produced almonds. It was kept as a permanent, visible warning. The message was clear. The Aaron and Levite authority structure was absolutely not to be messed with.
Which brings us to our final section, the ultimate inheritance. So, fast forward through decades of wandering, the original, faithless generation is passed on, and a new generation is finally standing on the plains of Moab, ready to cross into the Promised Land. It's time to divide up the ultimate reward. But here again, the Levites are completely set apart. For the 12 standard fighting tribes, their inheritance was highly physical. They were about to cross the Jordan River and get these massive tracts of real estate in the super fertile land of Canaan. But the Levites? Absolutely zero land inheritance. God explicitly declared to them, "I am your portion and your inheritance." Think about that for a second. Instead of massive wealthy territories, they inherited God himself, along with the duty to manage specific towns scattered throughout all the other tribes, most notably 6 cities of refuge.
These cities of refuge were absolutely crucial. They were basically safe havens designed for a very specific ancient justice system. If someone accidentally killed another person, manslaughter essentially, they could flee to one of these 6 cities to escape the victim's family, the so-called Avenger of Blood, who would likely be out for revenge. So, because they didn't have this giant centralized territory of their own to manage, these landless Levites basically became the critical administrators of ancient Israel's justice and sanctuary system, keeping the peace across the entire newly conquered nation. The Book of Numbers really paints this incredible, vivid picture of a holy God and the monumental task of living right in his presence. The Levites weren't drafted to fight enemy armies. They were drafted to face the terrifying, awe-inspiring weight of the divine. They literally traded earthly wealth and physical property for what was arguably the most dangerous job in the ancient world. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating final thought. If your entire life's inheritance wasn't property and it wasn't wealth, but was instead this dangerous, all-consuming, and totally sacred duty to something far greater than yourself, would you be willing to carry the weight? Something to think about as we wrap up today's explainer. Thanks so much for joining me, and as always, keep questioning and keep learning.